Mark had lived many quiet years after leaving the army. His farm was small and far from the busy towns of the colony world. Life was simple, repairing fences, tending crops, and keeping his tools working. He liked the silence, though sometimes it felt heavy. He had fought many battles in his younger days, but now his greatest struggle was to keep the soil from drying out. One afternoon, Mark traveled to the nearby city to look for spare tools at the alien market. The market was known for strange items brought from distant worlds. Merchants shouted about shining crystals, devices of unknown use, and even small alien pets that chirped inside cages. Mark did not enjoy the noise, but he knew sometimes useful parts could be found among the junk. He walked past stalls of glowing fruit and machines with blinking lights. Then he heard a deep sound, a low growl that shook the air. Mark turned toward it and saw a sight that made him stop in his tracks. Behind heavy bars, there was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen in war or peace. It was a dragon, at least, that was the closest word his mind could find. Her scales shimmered faintly under the lights, though many were scratched and dull. Her wings were folded tightly, and she looked weak, but her golden eyes still burned with strength. Next to her were 6 small hatchlings. They were no larger than dogs, tumbling over each other with soft cries. They looked hungry, their tiny wings twitching, their tails curling around each other. The mother dragon lifted her head when one of the young squealed. She growled again, but it was not anger, it was the warning of a protector. The auctioneer, a tall alien with gray skin, shouted over the noise. Rare find from the outer systems. 1 lone female and 6 hatchlings. Starting price is low, as they are difficult to keep alive. Who dares to bid? The crowd laughed. Some muttered that the creatures were dangerous. Others called them worthless. Too much trouble, one man said. They eat too much and fight too much, another said. But Mark did not hear their words. His eyes stayed on the dragons. He saw more than scales and teeth. He saw a wounded mother trying to shield her young. He remembered the battlefields of his past, where he had seen soldiers do the same for those they cared about. Something stirred in him, a feeling he had thought long gone. The bidding began, but few raised their hands. The crowd did not want responsibility for such creatures. The auctioneer grew impatient. No one willing to take them, he barked. Mark's voice rose before he could stop himself. I will. Heads turned. The people whispered and chuckled. An old soldier, living alone, wanting a beast and her brood, it sounded foolish to them. But Mark did not step back. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. You have the credits, human. Mark gave a firm nod. He still had savings from his service. He had planned to use them for farm repairs, but now they had another purpose. Within minutes, the deal was struck. The crowd muttered as the cage was rolled toward him. Some shook their heads, certain he would regret it. As Mark walked beside the cage, the mother dragon glared at him. Her eyes were sharp, watching every step. The hatchlings pressed against her side, making soft sounds. Mark stopped and placed his hand slowly against the bars. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He only stood there, steady and calm, the way he once did with frightened recruits. For a long moment, the dragon stared at him. Then, with a slow breath, she lowered her head toward her young. Mark took that as enough. She did not trust him yet, but she had allowed him near without striking. That was the first step. The cage was loaded onto a cart, and Mark led it out of the market. The crowd's noise faded behind him, replaced by the creak of wheels and the distant calls of birds. He looked back once more. The mother dragon's golden eyes still glowed, fierce and proud. Mark felt something inside him shift. His farm would never be quiet again. He had come to buy simple tools, but he was leaving with a family of fire and wings. He smiled faintly to himself. Looks like I've got work to do, he whispered. The path home stretched before him, and though it was uncertain, Mark knew he would not walk it alone anymore. The journey back to Mark's farm was slow and heavy. The cart creaked under the weight of the cage, and the dragons inside shifted restlessly. The hatchlings squealed and clawed at the bars, while the mother dragon stayed still, her golden eyes watching every turn of the road. Mark guided the cart carefully, though his mind was filled with thoughts. He had no idea how to raise dragons. He only knew one thing: he would not let them die in a cage. When he reached his farm, the land stretched wide under the pale sky. His small house stood near a cluster of sheds, with fields spreading out on both sides. Life here had always been quiet, but now it would change. He stopped the cart near an empty barn, one that had not been used for years. It would need work, but it was large enough to shelter the creatures. Mark opened the barn doors and guided the cart inside. The dragons hissed, their wings scraping against the cage. He kept his voice steady. "Easy now. You'll be safe here." With slow care, he unlocked the cage. The metal creaked as the door opened. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then one hatchling stumbled out, its claws clicking against the wooden floor. Another followed, chirping softly. Soon all six were tumbling around, their tails tangling, their wings flapping weakly. The mother dragon stepped out last. She was taller than Mark, her scales shimmering faintly in the light. She lowered her head, her gaze fixed on him. Mark did not move quickly. He simply stood with his hands open at his sides, showing no weapon. The dragon growled low, warning him to stay back. Mark nodded. "I hear you. I won't hurt them." For days, life on the farm became a careful dance. Mark brought food: meat from the market, water from the well, and hay for bedding. The hatchlings ate eagerly, their small jaws snapping. The mother dragon, whom Mark had begun to call Solara, waited until her young were fed before touching the food herself. She never let Mark too close, but she did not strike him either. Mark worked hard to repair the barn. He used old army tools to strengthen the walls and built a roof patch so rain would not leak inside. He lined the ground with thick straw, making it softer for the dragons. Each night, the hatchlings curled against Solara's side, their small breaths filling the barn with warmth. Mark often watched from the doorway, silent. He had seen soldiers sleep like that, huddled together for comfort in cold camps. Trust grew slowly, like a seed pushing through hard soil. Mark kept his movements calm and his tone steady. When one hatchling stumbled near him, he crouched low and gently pushed it back toward its mother. Solara growled, but she allowed it. Another day, a hatchling nipped at his boot, curious. Mark laughed softly, the first real laugh he had felt in years. He began speaking to them each morning. "Food's here. Fresh water too. You're safe now." His words meant little to them, but his tone carried meaning. The hatchlings learned his voice, their heads tilting whenever he spoke. One evening, Mark sat just outside the barn, sharpening an old farming blade. The sun was low, painting the fields in gold. He heard a sound behind him and turned slowly. Solara was standing at the doorway, her eyes glowing in the fading light. For the first time, she stepped forward without growling. She lowered her head slightly, as if studying him. Mark did not move. He waited, calm and patient. Solara sniffed the air, her breath warm against his arm. Then she turned back and returned to her young. It was only a moment, but Mark knew what it meant. The first wall of mistrust had cracked. Days turned into weeks. The hatchlings grew stronger. They chased each other around the barn, leaping clumsily, their wings beating the air. Sometimes they even followed Mark when he carried buckets of water, their eyes wide with curiosity. He began to train them in small ways, teaching them not to bite the wooden beams, guiding them back to their mother when they strayed too far. Solara watched everything. At first her eyes were sharp, ready to strike if he harmed them. But slowly, her gaze softened. She saw how he never raised his hand against them, how he gave them food before himself, how he fixed their shelter with care. One night, as rain fell outside, Solara allowed Mark to step inside the barn and sit near the straw. She did not growl. She only curled around her young, her golden eyes glowing in the dim light, and let him stay. Mark leaned against the wall, listening to the sound of the hatchlings breathing. He felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt since his army days. Back then, he had protected his squad, his brothers and sisters in arms. Now, he was protecting a different kind of family. The farm no longer felt empty. Every morning, the cries of the hatchlings filled the air. Every night, the sight of Solara guarding them brought him peace. He had not planned for this, but he welcomed it. Mark whispered to himself as he closed the barn door one night. "You're not alone anymore." And neither morning sunlight spilled across the farm, painting the fields in soft gold. Mark stepped out of his small house with a bucket in each hand. Inside the barn, he could already hear the sound of claws scratching against wood and the playful cries of the young dragons. Every day now began the same way, not with silence as before, but with life and noise. When Mark opened the barn doors, the hatchlings rushed forward, wings flapping clumsily, tails sweeping across the straw. They tumbled over one another, chirping as if to demand food at once. Solara, the mother dragon, lifted her head slowly. Her golden eyes caught the light, and she watched Mark with quiet strength. She no longer growled when he entered, though her gaze always followed his steps. "Easy," Mark said softly, lowering the buckets. He laid out chunks of meat and poured fresh water into a trough. The hatchlings scrambled toward the food, snapping their small jaws. Mark smiled faintly. They were wild and clumsy, but each day they grew taller, their wings stronger, their scales brighter. He had begun giving them simple names to tell them apart. The smallest one, with silver-tipped wings, he called Spark. The largest, always trying to lead the others, he named Stone. There was Ember, quick and restless, and Shade, who often liked to hide behind the others. The last two, Flame and Ash, were twins in both look and habit, always side by side. Solara did not seem to mind the names. In fact, when Mark called them, the hatchlings sometimes turned their heads, as if beginning to understand. Trust grew day by day. At first, Mark only placed the food and stood back. Now, the hatchlings sometimes climbed over his boots or tugged at his sleeves with tiny teeth. He never pushed them away harshly. Instead, he guided them back gently, teaching them to wait for food and to follow his hand. His soldiers' patience served him well. One afternoon, Mark decided it was time for the hatchlings to feel the open air. He opened the barn doors wide and stepped back. The young dragons hesitated at first, blinking against the bright light. Then Spark darted forward, wings flapping. One by one, the others followed, stumbling into the field with cries of excitement. The sight filled Mark's chest with warmth. The hatchlings chased one another through the grass, rolling and leaping. Their small wings beat the air, lifting them only inches above the ground before they tumbled again. They played without fear, their joy spilling across the land. Solara stepped out slowly, her wings stretching wide. In the sunlight, her scales shone with a faint glow, a reminder of the power that still lived within her. She looked around the open space, then at Mark. For a moment, her gaze held his, steady and calm. Then she lowered her head slightly, as if giving silent approval. Mark stood near the fence, watching as the hatchlings chased each other in circles. He remembered young soldiers he had once trained, their clumsy eagerness and reckless energy. These dragons were no different. They needed guidance, rules, and patience. He felt the old instincts returning, the part of him that knew how to lead. Over the following weeks, Mark began small lessons. He clapped his hands sharply when they grew too wild, teaching them to pause and look at him. He guided them in lines, encouraging them to follow his steps. At first, they ignored him, running in every direction. But slowly, they learned to gather when he called, their heads tilting curiously toward his voice. Even Solara seemed to take interest. She often watched from the side, her golden eyes glowing. When one hatchling grew too rough with another, she let out a deep growl, and instantly they calmed. It felt as though she was working with him, helping to shape their young. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Mark sat on the fence while the hatchlings rested near Solara. The air was cool, and the sound of their soft breathing filled the quiet. Mark leaned back, his gaze drifting to the stars above. He thought about his past, about the years of marching, fighting, and surviving. Back then, he had always felt a heavy weight on his shoulders, the duty to protect those beside him. When he left the army, that weight turned into emptiness. He had no one to lead, no one to watch over. Now, watching the dragon sleep, that emptiness was gone. The weight had returned, but it was not heavy this time. It was steady, grounding him. He had a new family to care for. The next day proved how much they had grown. When Mark walked into the field with a piece of cloth tied to a stick, the hatchlings gathered quickly, their eyes locked on the moving flag. He waved it left and right, then lifted it high. The dragons leapt, their wings flapping harder than ever before. For the first time, Ember lifted fully off the ground, hovering for a heartbeat before landing. Mark cheered softly. "You'll fly one day," he said, his voice proud. "All of you." That night, as Mark closed the barn doors, Solara stepped close. She lowered her head until her snout nearly touched his shoulder. Her breath was warm, her eyes steady. Mark froze, not in fear, but in awe. Slowly, he reached out and touched her scales. They were rough yet strong, like stone warmed by the sun. Solara did not pull away. It was a moment of trust, a bond sealed without words. Mark knew then that she no longer saw him as a stranger. He was part of their circle now. As he walked back to his house, the stars glittered above. The farm was no longer just his land. It was their home, shared between man and dragon. And together, they were becoming something stronger than either could be alone. The farm had grown louder and brighter with each passing week. Where once only the wind moved through the fields, now there were cries, roars, and the sound of wings beating the air. The 6 young dragons had grown taller, their scales shining with color. They no longer stumbled when they ran, and their wings carried them for short glides across the grass. Solara, their mother, stood stronger than before, her wounds healed and her body filled with new energy. Mark watched them with quiet pride, but he also felt a growing unease. Dragons, no matter how well hidden, were not the kind of secret that stayed safe for long. One afternoon, as Mark repaired the fence near the road, he noticed 2 strangers pausing to look toward his land. They were merchants, their cart filled with goods from the city. One of them leaned on the fence and pointed toward the sky where Ember and Shade were gliding clumsily in the distance. "Did you see that?" the man whispered to his partner. Mark stepped forward quickly. "Private land," he said firmly. "Keep moving." The men glanced at him, then at each other. One smirked, but they did not argue. With a tug on their cart, they moved on, their voices fading down the road. Still, Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. Word would spread now. Someone would tell others about the strange creatures flying over his farm. That evening, as the hatchlings rested in the barn, Mark sat outside sharpening an old spade. His soldier's instincts were awake again. He had lived through enough battles to know what happened when people wanted something rare. First came curiosity. Then came greed. And greed was always followed by danger. The next few days proved his worries true. More travelers paused on the road. Some tried to peer over the fences, pretending to be innocent passers-by. Others lingered near the gate, asking questions about the noises and the shadows moving in the fields. Mark answered little and sent them away, but he could feel eyes always watching. One night, while checking the barn, he heard a rustle in the dark beyond the fence. Solara lifted her head sharply, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Mark gripped his lantern and stepped forward. He saw figures moving away, slipping into the shadows. Whoever they were, they had been too close. The next morning, Mark began preparing. His farm had once been only soil and crops, but now it would become something more. He searched through his storage shed and pulled out old equipment he had saved from his army years: sturdy wire, metal stakes, and a few simple alarms made from cans and bells. He built stronger fences, digging the posts deep. He stretched wire across the gates and set traps that would rattle loudly if disturbed. Around the barn, he placed small alarms that would clang if anyone tried to sneak near. The work was slow, but his hands were steady. He knew what he was building. Not just a farm, but a fortress. The dragon seemed to sense the change. The hatchlings followed him as he worked, chirping curiously. Spark often tried to tug at the wire, while Stone stood tall as if guarding the area. Solara stayed close too, her golden eyes always on him. Mark could feel her watching, as though she understood the danger that crept closer each day. One afternoon, a local official rode up to his gate. She was a tall woman with a stern face, her uniform sharp. "We've had reports of unusual activity here," she said. "Creatures not of this world. Rare creatures." Mark stood calmly. "This is my land. My animals are under my care. They are not for sale." The official studied him. "Be careful," she warned. "There are people who would pay much for what you're hiding. More than you can imagine." "I'm not interested," Mark replied. She gave a short nod, then turned her horse and left. Mark knew her visit was not the end. It was only the beginning. That night, the farm was quiet. Too quiet. Mark sat outside with his lantern, scanning the dark fields. The hatchlings slept inside the barn, curled close to Solara. The stars shone bright overhead, but Mark's eyes stayed on the shadows. He remembered countless nights on the battlefield, waiting for the enemy to move. He felt the same weight in the air now. Solara lifted her head and gave a deep rumble. Mark nodded slowly. "I know. They'll come." The next day, he trained the hatchlings in small but important ways. He clapped his hands sharply, teaching them to gather at his signal. He guided them into the barn quickly, showing them to move fast when danger came. Though they were young, their instincts were strong, and they began to respond. Solara too stood ready, her wings spreading wide whenever Mark raised his hand. The bond between them was no longer just trust, it was a partnership. Man and dragon, preparing together for what was coming. As the sun set over the hills, Mark looked across his land. His heart was steady. Trouble was on its way, but he was not afraid. He had faced enemies before, and he would do so again. Only this time, he was not alone. He whispered into the fading light, his eyes on the barn where Solara and the hatchlings rested. "This farm is our home. No one is taking it from us." The night was dark and still. Clouds hid the stars, and the farm lay in silence. Mark sat near the barn with a lantern by his side, listening. His ears had grown sharp again in these last weeks, sharper than they had been since his army days. The crickets sang in the grass, but beyond that, he heard only stillness. Stillness on a farm was not peace. It was warning. Inside the barn, the 6 hatchlings slept in a pile of scales and wings, warm against Solara's side. The mother dragon dozed with one golden eye half open, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She too felt the stillness. Her tail twitched, tapping lightly against the straw. Mark gripped the handle of his lantern. He had been waiting for this moment since the first whispers began in town. He knew the dragons would not stay a secret forever. The question had never been if someone would come. The question had been when. The answer came just past midnight. A faint clatter reached his ears, the sound of a boot against loose stone. Then another sound, metal brushing against wood. Mark rose slowly, keeping low, and peered toward the fence. Shadows moved in the dark, slipping between posts. At least 5 figures, maybe more. Their shapes were hard to see, but their movements were quick and careful. These were not travelers. These were raiders. Mark's heartbeat slowed, not quickened. His soldier's mind took over, calm and clear. He stepped back to the barn door and whispered, "Stay ready." Solara lifted her head at once, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She understood. The raiders drew closer, carrying nets and poles. Mark could hear their whispers now. "Take the little ones first. Keep the big one distracted." Mark's jaw tightened. They were after the hatchlings. He moved quickly, pulling a small bell from the fence wire. With one sharp tug, the hidden alarms around the farm clattered to life. Metal cans banged together, a sudden chorus of noise ringing across the fields. The raiders froze, startled, but it was already too late. From inside the barn came a roar that shook the air. Solara surged forward, wings spreading wide. Her golden eyes blazed in the dark as her cry echoed across the land. The hatchlings, awakened by the sound, screeched with high-pitched cries of their own. The raiders charged, thinking speed would win them victory. Mark stepped into their path. He carried no gun, but he carried his soldier's training. He moved fast, shoving one raider off balance and sending him sprawling. Another swung a pole, but Mark ducked low, grabbed the man's arm, and twisted until the pole clattered to the ground. At that moment, the dragons joined the fight. Stone barreled out of the barn, his wings flapping wildly, knocking 2 raiders to the ground. Spark spat a burst of smoke and sparks, the heat forcing another raider to stumble back. Ember leapt onto a man's back, her claws catching his cloak and pulling him down. The raiders had thought the hatchlings were helpless. They were wrong. Solara stormed forward with a thunderous roar. She lashed her tail against the ground, sending dirt flying. One raider raised a net, but she batted it aside with a sweep of her wing. Another tried to lunge with a pole, but Solara snapped her jaws close enough to send him fleeing in terror. Her strength and fury made it clear she would not allow anyone near her young. Mark used every bit of his training to guide the chaos. He shouted sharp commands, not at the raiders, but at the hatchlings. Back, spark. Circle, stone. Stay with me. His voice cut through the noise, and to his surprise, the young dragons listened. They moved clumsily but followed his direction, forming a loose line in front of the barn. The raiders began to falter. Their plan had been simple: steal rare creatures, sell them for fortune. But they had not expected a veteran soldier leading the beasts as though they were trained troops. They had not expected the dragons to fight as one. One man shouted, "Fall back! Fall back!" The raiders turned, retreating into the shadows from where they came. Solara roared after them, the sound rolling across the fields like thunder. The hatchlings hissed and chirped, but Mark raised his hand. "Hold!" His voice was firm. They quieted, though their eyes still glowed with fire. When the last shadow vanished into the night, silence returned. The alarms rattled softly in the wind, then stilled. Mark let out a slow breath and lowered his shoulders. The fight was over, at least for now. He turned to Solara. She stood tall, her chest heaving, her golden eyes locked on him. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Solara lowered her head and gave a low rumble, not of warning but of respect. Mark stepped closer, resting his hand gently on her scales. "You did well," he whispered. The hatchlings crowded around, pressing against his legs, their wings brushing his arms. They chirped softly, looking up at him with bright eyes. Mark knelt and stroked their heads one by one. All of you did well. The barn was safe. The farm still stood. But Mark knew the battle had only begun. Those raiders would return, and others would follow. Word would spread fast now. Still, as he looked at Solara and her young, he felt no fear. He had faced worse with less at his side. Together, they had proven something this night, that man and dragon could fight as one. Mark stood tall, his voice steady in the quiet air. Let them come. This is our home. We'll protect it together. The morning after the attack was quiet. The air was cool, the sky painted with soft shades of pink and gold. Mark walked across the farm slowly, his boots crunching against the soil. The events of the night still echoed in his mind, the shadows, the clash, the roars. Yet as he looked toward the barn, he felt a steady calm. They had defended their home. Together. Inside, Solara rested with her young. The hatchlings stirred as Mark stepped in, chirping and flapping their wings. Stone stretched his neck tall, Ember darted forward with playful energy, and Spark leapt toward Mark's boots, pawing at his leg. Mark crouched down, patting their heads one by one. Their scales were warm, and their bright eyes followed him with trust. Solara lifted her head, watching closely. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the dim barn light. For weeks she had guarded her distance, but now something had shifted. She no longer looked at Mark with suspicion. Instead, her gaze carried recognition. He was not just a caretaker. He was part of them. Mark set down fresh water and food. As the hatchlings ate, Solara rose and stepped closer. Her movements were smooth, her wings brushing against the straw. She lowered her head until her snout nearly touched Mark's shoulder. Her breath was warm, her presence immense. Slowly, Mark raised a hand and rested it against her scales. Solara rumbled low, not in warning but in peace. In that moment, the bond between man and dragon deepened. Mark was no longer an outsider. He was family. Life on the farm changed after the attack. Mark strengthened the fences, repaired the alarms, and kept watch at night. But he was not alone in his work. The hatchlings began following him during his chores, their curious eyes always bright. They tugged at ropes, nosed at tools, and even tried to carry small buckets in their jaws. Though clumsy, their effort made Mark chuckle. "You're soldiers in training," he would say, his voice soft with pride. Training became part of their days. Each morning, Mark led them into the field. He clapped his hands, called their names, and guided them into simple drills. At first, they scattered in every direction, wings flapping wildly. But slowly, they learned to move together. Stone, being the largest, often took the lead. Spark was quick and eager, darting ahead. Ember raced in circles, full of restless energy, while Shade lurked quietly at the back, watchful as always. The twins, Flame and Ash, never left each other's side, moving as though they shared one mind. Mark's commands grew sharper, and the hatchlings responded with growing discipline. Solara often watched from the edge, her eyes steady. Sometimes she joined, letting out a deep growl that made the young ones line up faster than any command Mark could give. Together, they were shaping the dragons not just into a family but into a team. Evenings were quieter. Mark would sit by the barn, a lantern glowing beside him. The hatchlings curled in the straw, and Solara rested nearby, her wings wrapped protectively around them. Sometimes one of the hatchlings would crawl out and climb onto Mark's lap, nuzzling close before falling asleep. The warmth of their scales reminded him of campfires during long marches, when young soldiers leaned close to find rest. It had been years since Mark had felt such belonging. In the army, he had lived for his squad, guarding them with his life. When he retired, he thought that part of him was gone forever. But now, Sitting in the barn with dragons breathing softly around him, he realized he had found it again. Not in soldiers, but in creatures who had accepted him as their own. News from the outside world did not stop. Traders still passed by the road, whispering about the dragon farm. Some came to offer gold, others to threaten. Mark turned them all away. He needed no riches. What he had was worth far more. Still, he knew danger would return. Greed always came back stronger. But this time, Mark did not feel the same weight of fear. He had Solara at his side, fierce and loyal. He had 6 growing hatchlings who trusted his voice. He was no longer one man guarding a farm. He was the leader of a new family. One night, as rain fell gently across the fields, Mark stood at the barn door, watching the water drip from the roof. Solara stepped beside him, her massive form sheltering him from the rain. She turned her head slightly, her golden eye meeting his. For a long moment, no words were needed. The bond was clear. Mark reached up and placed his hand against her neck. "We'll be ready," he whispered. Behind them, the hatchlings stirred, their cries soft and eager. The farm no longer felt like a lonely corner of the world. It was alive, strong, and united. Mark had thought his life after war would be silence and soil. Instead, it had become fire, wings, and family. And though shadows still gathered beyond the fence, he felt steady. For the first time in many years, he did not carry the burden of protecting alone. Together, they were stronger. Together, they would stand. The colony authorities arrived sooner than Mark expected. Weeks had passed since the attack, and the dragons had grown stronger under his care. Their wings stretched wider, their steps carried more weight, and their eyes glowed with sharper fire. Still, Mark knew nothing could stay hidden forever. Word of dragons traveled far, and such power always drew attention. On a bright morning, a convoy of armored carriers rolled down the dirt road leading to Mark's farm. Dust swirled as heavy machines stopped at his gate. Soldiers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, weapons slung over their shoulders. At the center stood a tall officer with silver hair, his eyes scanning the land like a hawk. Mark walked forward, his back straight, the old soldier in him showing. "This is private land," he said firmly. The officer's gaze shifted to the barn, where faint growls rumbled from within. "We've received reports," the officer replied. "Reports of creatures not registered with the colony. Dangerous creatures." Mark's jaw tightened. He had dealt with this tone before, cold, commanding, seeing only threats. "They're not dangerous," he said. "They're family." The officer gave a small smile, one that carried no warmth. "Family or not, they belong under our control. For the safety of the colony." Before Mark could answer, the barn doors creaked open. Solara stepped out, her golden eyes flashing in the sun. The hatchlings followed close, their wings half spread, their growls low. Soldiers froze, some gripping their weapons tighter. The ground seemed to tremble under the dragon's presence. Mark raised a hand calmly. "Stand down," he said, both to the soldiers and to the dragons. Solara's growl quieted, but her stance remained strong. She towered above the men, her body shielding her young. The officer studied the scene with sharp eyes. "Remarkable," he muttered. Then his voice turned harder. "These creatures could tip the balance of power. You understand why they cannot remain here, under a single man's care." Mark's heart pounded, but his voice stayed steady. "I fought in wars," he said. "I've seen what power in the wrong hands can do. If you take them, you'll turn them into weapons. But here, they have a home. Here, they are more than weapons. They are living beings." A tense silence fell. Soldiers shifted uneasily. Solara lifted her wings slightly, casting a vast shadow. The hatchlings hissed in unison, their eyes glowing. At last, the officer lowered his gaze. You are asking us to trust you with something greater than yourself. Mark nodded. Yes. Trust me. Or trust them. They know who I am. And they chose me. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Solara stepped closer to Mark, lowering her head beside him. Her golden eye met the officer's gaze. The gesture was clear. The officer exhaled slowly. Very well. For now, the dragons stay. But if ever they threaten the colony, responsibility falls on you. Mark accepted the weight with a simple nod. He had carried heavier burdens in war. This one, at least, was carried with pride. When the convoy rolled away, the farm grew quiet again. Mark turned to Solara and the hatchlings. They gathered around him, wings brushing against his arms, claws scraping the soil. He looked at each of them, feeling the bond stronger than ever. That night, the sky cleared, stars shining bright. Mark stood in the field as Solara stretched her wings wide. One by one, the hatchlings spread theirs as well, testing the wind. The time had come for something new. Go on, Mark said softly. Show the sky who you are. With a roar, Solara leapt upward, her wings beating the air with thunderous force. The hatchlings followed, clumsy at first but growing steadier with each flap. They rose higher, circling above the farm, their scales glinting like sparks of fire against the night sky. Mark watched, his heart swelling. He had trained soldiers before, but nothing compared to this, watching dragons claim the sky, free and unbound. The colony might watch, others might plot, but Mark knew the truth. These dragons were not just creatures from an auction. They were not tools or trophies. They were a family forged in trust, in struggle, in care. As Solara circled back, her roar echoed across the valley, carrying strength and warning. It was a sound that told the world these skies were no longer empty. They belonged to dragons. And to the man who stood with them. Mark smiled, lifting his head to the stars. His life as a soldier had ended, but something greater had begun. Not a war. Not a mission. A legacy. Together, they were a story no one could buy or control. Together, they were hope, fire, and freedom. The sky belonged to them now. And they would guard it, side by side.